Make sure your insurance doesn't come up short. Get gap cover with ALA. For more information, follow the links in the description.
Hello everybody. I suppose I was a little bit too young to really appreciate it at the time, but growing up in the 1990s, I was surrounded by what is arguably the beginning of Ford's greatest era of producing affordable drivers' cars, all spearheaded by the legendary and sadly late Richard Parry Jones. And today, conventional wisdom can often dictate that any car built before his arrival just didn't handle all that well. But is that entirely true? Though his influence was no doubt significant, I think Ford themselves were still perfectly capable of creating a pretty decent car. And so, to test that theory, I am today driving the last of the performance Fords introduced before Mr. Parry Jones's arrival. This is a 1994 Mark 3.5 Fiesta RS1800. And this should be good. You know, sometimes I think the humble Fiesta just doesn't get the credit that it deserves, though just about anybody and everybody agrees that it is a genuinely brilliant car, and we're all very, very sad to see it go. Seldom do I ever hear the Fiesta mentioned in the same breath as such icons as the Golf. And it really deserves to be, because though you could certainly argue it's in a different class, this being equivalent instead to the Polo, it is just about as long-lived, having arrived a very short while after the original Golf in 1976. That was then facelifted into the Mark II, and then for 1989 an all-new Mark III was introduced, featuring better suspension with semi-independent at the rear, joining the independent McPherson strut of the front. The styling was revised, though there were many who criticised it for being just a little bit plain. The interior also new, meaning that this car today, despite being based on a model introduced at the tail end of the 80s, does genuinely feel more like a product of the 1990s. And rather embarrassingly, there are a few elements in it, like the mirror adjustment over here, that I do recognise from cars that were built quite some time after production on this wrapped up in 1995, to be replaced by the Mark IV, which was then generally much more loved, partly on account of the influence of one Mr. Richard Parry Jones. Though it is evident, I think, that there was something fundamentally right with this, because that Mark IV itself then gave rise to such icons as the original Ka and even the Puma. But we're not here to talk about that, instead we're here to talk about this. And it is fair to say that the Mark III Fiesta arrived in the midst of hot hatch mania, because by the end of the 1980s, it was the car that anybody and everybody wanted to have. And to keep those buyers happy, Ford introduced a number of different cars with the arrival of the Mark III. First, the XR2i, taking over from the old XR2, but now with fuel injection, making 105 horsepower. And then joining that as the de facto range topper, you had the 133 horsepower RS Turbo, with a 1.6 litre version of the old and somewhat unloved CVH engine that some have described to me as constantly vibrating and harsh. That then lasted until 1992, when the Ranger was facelifted and both it and the XR2i were discontinued. The new flagship then being this, the RS1800. And, as the name would suggest, it is now powered by a naturally aspirated but slightly larger 1.8 litre engine. But unlike the old cars, which used the CVH, this had an all-new engine, codenamed Zeta, which you and I might better know as the Z-Tech. And impressively, despite the loss of the turbo, power remained almost the same at 130 horses, and torque is 120 pounds-feet, down from the 135 of the old car. The suspension was also revised, presumably to appeal more to the keener driver. The equipment level was also generous, with this car having a sunroof, electric windows, electric mirrors, and a radio. Yeah. Oh, you've also got these very nicely sculpted buckety seats, not Recaro's, instead possibly a Ford's own design, but still, they do the job quite well. And the fabric trim in here is utterly and deliciously 1990s, as are all of the touch points. And to be honest with you, the first thing that struck me when I saw this car is just how tiny it is. It's adorable. It's just 3 3/4 meters long and 1.6 meters wide, which means when you're in it, you feel like you're driving a Mini. This car belongs to a lovely chap called James, who as a younger man had an XR2i, so the pre-facelift one. That he then parked in his mother's garage, left it there for a while, until she then sold it. Now at the time, they weren't worth very much money at all, but he really missed that car, and so decided a while ago to get himself another Mark III Fiesta. Going on the hunt, he then saw this appear as a sort of barn find, being over in Jersey and with just 34,000 miles on the clock. Today, it has just over 50,000 a decade later, and in that time, he spent quite a bit on having the car restored and refurbished, with much of the cosmetic work being done by Platinum Paintworks in Kimbolton, who he says did a very good job indeed. And from what I can see, I'd have to agree with him. The other thing that he said to me is that I really should drive it properly, because this is a car built to be enjoyed, and I wouldn't want to let him down. You know, I am a great believer that time machines already exist. They're called classic cars, and this is a perfect example, because in spite of the fact that I can't ever remember in my life being in a Mark III Fiesta, I'm sure I have, but just wasn't significant enough to remember, you get in this and suddenly you are taken to a different place and a different time. One that looks and sounds a bit like this. The last car I drove that is in something like this category was the old Peugeot 206 GTI, but in truth, that's a much later car. A fairer comparison really with the Mark V Fiesta. And more recently I also got to drive the Mini John Cooper Works GP, but that too is a very, very unfair comparison. And this of course is nowhere near as quick. Curb weight was a little bit tricky to find, but I believe it's somewhere around a ton. Some figures claiming it's a fair bit under and some figures claiming it's a fair bit over, but let's just call it a ton. With 130 horsepower on tap, it then gives you a power to weight ratio of 130 horsepower per ton, which is not masses, but that means you have to then lean on the chassis to make progress. And the car is now sat on a set of new SPAC suspension. And those are on here because the old setup was simply knackered, and unfortunately the original parts are no longer available. This apparently is about the closest you can get, but in its defense, I expect that is the same for a great number of these out there. Very few, I suppose, will still be on their original suspension, and even fewer still on original suspension in good condition. But be that as it may, this is a very, very enjoyable steer. Does it have the interactivity, the excitement of some of the later cars? No, not quite. But nor is it the horrible old blancmange I was worried it was going to be. It's a little riot, this thing. As instructed and expected, to make best progress, you have to make use of both the gears and the rev range. And at all times, you're never really going quite as quick as you think you are, but that's absolutely fine. Visibility, of course, is excellent, with all the pillars being paper thin, and there's so much glass in the back that in this rearview mirror, I can't even see the car. What I can see is the heated rear screen, which in its day would also have been fancy, and its very unusual pattern. Oh, 3-point turn, hill start, torture test. Place your bets. Controls are all pretty nice, easy, familiar. Pedals are actually not too close together. Stalks, nice, they work. Indicators, lovely and loud. Right, what's the turning circle like? Let's see. Actually pretty good. And of course the thing is tiny. Reverse easy to get into. How's the handbrake? Blimey, that's really good. Really, really good. Braking is by discs all round, and those behave pretty well. The power steering in this, nice, light, but still gives you a good amount of feel. And this aftermarket exhaust, also installed for the same reason as the dampers, the original was shot and irreplaceable, has been set up rather nicely. It's a little fruitier than the standard one, but it is not offensive. The cat is still in place, and this makes a really gorgeous period noise. Not quite like an old 1970s twin cam, nor is it quite like the item you'd find in, say, a Renault Clio 172 or 182. It's got its own character. I quite like it. Though the red line is set at a relatively modest 6,500, the engine will pull all the way to it, with it making power right up until the point where the needle touches the red bit. I've also just noticed this beautifully simple dashboard. I absolutely love it. On your left, you've got your rev counter. In the middle, you've got your speed. Below that, you've got your trip counter. And then on the right, you've got your fuel gauge and also your temperature gauge. But the temperature gauge has got at the bottom cold, at the top red for hot, and then in the middle it is just marked as norm. So the needle clearly will still move as you'd expect it to, not like a modern car, but they were already realising people were a little bit dense on occasion and didn't realise that it is normal for a needle to not stay absolutely rigid the entire time you drive a car. Oh yeah. Now, one thing I'm not certain of is where these cars were built. JayEmm said he thought they might actually be from Dagenham. I thought maybe they were going to be from Germany, but either way, I've got to say I'm very impressed with it. There aren't many creaks or rattles in here at all. It also has a decent amount of space in the boot. This is a 3-door. In fact, Ford were quite late to the party with introducing a 5-door Fiesta of any variant. But even so, there is room to put 4 people in here. You can easily go out to the pub, to a show, out for a picnic or something like that. Credit also has to be given to this 5-speed gearbox. The throw is quite long and the knob itself feels very classic 1980s square, but it's actually not got too much play in it. The action is quite pleasant and it's much better than I was expecting it to be. If I were to name a dynamic weak point, it is the steering. And I know this is something that the great Mr. Parry Jones did a lot to improve. It's just a little bit light and vague and doesn't really talk to you. Handily, the chassis does. The car still moves around, rolls a fair bit, and you get huge amounts of confidence through it. Apparently, these new dampers have allowed James to really push the car a lot more and truly enjoy it. But he does find himself, by his own admission, a little bit worried about this car, because he said on occasion he finds himself as a grown man driving around in a 30-year-old Fiesta like a bloke pretending to be a boy. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with enjoying playing with your toys. I've just set up my old Nintendo 64 again, and I'm really enjoying it. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with taking a little bit of pleasure where we can find it? And with this car, not only will he enjoy it, but I know so will all the people that get to see it out and about. I've enjoyed it. And I'm lucky because I get to see it driving and then I get to drive it. And I don't see any reason why, if the mood took you, certainly through summer, you couldn't use this as a daily. It's a very pleasant thing indeed. But as you might imagine, if you were thinking of picking yourself up an old Ford, there are a few things you need to watch out for. Now, this is one of these cases where I think that the only sensible thing to do is to buy one that's already been restored. If somebody tells you they've got one of these that hasn't been restored and yet somehow is miraculously in good condition, I would treat that suspiciously indeed. It is not impossible, but it is, I think, unlikely. No prizes for guessing, but corrosion is indeed a big issue with these. And as is the case with just about every fast Ford, you do want to make sure that you're not buying into a car which has a hidden past. So, before you do purchase, make sure to use CarVertical, the super-powered super search that will cross-reference a number of databases from around the globe to give you all the information you want to know. Chiefly that Gary, Barry or Darry didn't do something rather silly with their Fiesta, only for you to find out a little bit too late. The search takes just 60 seconds and all you need is a registration number or a VIN. Even better, for 20% off the service, don't forget to use my discount code JayEmm. And though in the last decade these cars have certainly appreciated significantly, and James tells me in that time he's seen attitudes towards it change, they're still nowhere near as valuable as many other things to wear the blue oval. And I've got to admit, I was somewhat shocked when I saw you could pick yourself up today an example of an RS1800 with modest mileage on it for around £10,000. In fact, the examples I saw were cheaper than both the old RS Turbo and the XR2i. And it likely never helped the RS1800's case that there was very little visually really a badge, and that's almost it, to distinguish it from its forebears. And of course, if you were to read any group test, either contemporary or modern, they will tell you there was always a better car than the Fiesta RS, Clio Williams, 205 GTI, etc, etc, etc. But today, that's not the point. Today instead, I think the aim of the game should always be to buy the car that means something to you. And for James, this Fiesta means something to him. And for me, this is making me want to get out and experience a whole bunch of other classic Fords. So if you've got one and you'd like to see it on the channel, please send me an email. The address is talk@jayemm.com. It's in the description of every video. For now though, all that I wish to say is a big thank you to him for bringing his car out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.